So what we have inside this package is an incredibly powerful piece of kit created by Krikzz, sold by Stone Age Gamer, and called the EverDrive GBA X5. Now, if you're already familiar with the EverDrive line of products, you may be wondering why I didn't get the X7, because X3 is the starter, X5 is the mid-range, X7 is the Cadillac of EverDrives for each particular system that an EverDrive exists on. But Krikzz has not developed the X7 for Game Boy Advance yet. X5 is currently the top of the line. When we get to that point, X7 will probably include things like an in-game menu that you can access by either squeezing the cartridge or pressing a button on it, similar to the EverDrive X7 for Game Boy that I covered in a previous episode. But the nice thing about the GBA X5 is that it can do the same things that an EverDrive for Game Boy can do through emulation. It supports Game Boy Advance out of the box, but you can add extra functionality to it as well. Now, the GBA X5, like most EverDrives, does not come with the software installed, so just Google Krikzz GBA X5 when you get it in the mail, as I'm showing you right here, and that will bring you up to the support page where you can download the latest firmware for the system. Now, he did recently roll it back to a previous update because there was a glitch that he was not happy with in the version 1.13. So that may come out again at a later date. Maybe by the time you're watching this, 1.13 will have been restored. But for now, to keep it from crashing, he has rolled it back to 1.12. So make sure that you download the latest version that he has made available that is tested and working for your GBA X5. You will want to have a micro SD card formatted in FAT32. That's very easy to do on a Mac or PC. Expand the OS from Krikzz and drop GBA sys into the top level of your formatted micro SD. Then if you have any games like the ones I got from Stone Age Gamer that came free with purchase, drop those into the folder of your choice, also on the top level of your formatted micro SD card. I'm calling it the EverDrive ROM pack for convenience and memory that it came with my EverDrive, a set of 10 games. Eject it from your system so that it is safely removed and doesn't corrupt the files, and then pop the micro SD into the slot on the top of your GBA X5. If I have one and only one complaint about the X5, it's that micro SD cards are very tiny, and if you don't have a long thumbnail, it can be kind of hard to push it all the way down into place. And if you try to push it out, because it's a spring-loaded mechanism, it can be equally difficult to remove it. So maybe let one fingernail grow long, or have some kind of tool handy that you can push down on a tiny little surface. But anyway, as you can see here, we've got a GBA sys folder, which you can also hide in the options, and we've got the ROM pack that I got from Stone Age Gamer. Now, right out of the box, you're only going to be able to play the GBA games that are in the set of ROMs, and I'll show you why in just a second. But to show you the functionality, let's go into one of those GBA games. Let's do Super Bubble Pop. As you can see, the ROMs load very quickly. It takes just a couple of seconds to copy it over from your micro SD to some flash memory in the GBA, and maybe it'll take a little bit longer for bigger games, but I think a few seconds at the most, and it's worth the wait because you're getting the convenience of being able to play backups of all your Game Boy Advance games on demand. And for me, that's a really big deal because I own 150 plus GBA games, and being able to play them all on demand on one cartridge instead of trying to pick out any of a dozen to 150 games to try to carry around with me is a very, very good option. So, as mentioned, there is no other way to cycle the menu other than to turn the power on and off, because this is not the X7 model. But I don't think that's too much of an inconvenience. It's just flipping a power switch. But one thing that is an inconvenience, Game Boy games do not work right out of the box. You have to download the emulator Goomba.gba. And it says, please use Google to get this file, which is exactly accurate. You will find a website that has the ROM that you need. Now, to give you a little better picture of what that looks like figuratively and literally, I'm switching over to my backlit Game Boy Advance SP, the SpongeBob SquarePants edition. And now I've loaded up my EverDrive GBA X5 with a whole bunch of different things. Backups of all my games, hacks, Mega Man games, and NES games. Yes, there is a GBA NES emulator, which is why I said this can do everything that the Game Boy EverDrive can do, and more. And this comes in real handy when it comes to NES Classic ROMs, because Nintendo, for whatever reason, with the NES Classics for Game Boy Advance, they put some sort of extra layer of protection on them so that the ROMs don't work right in EverDrives or emulators. Maybe they were concerned about piracy or copyright, so do yourself a favor if you own those GBA games, put the NES emulator on here and put the ROMs for the NES games, the exact same games that were available in the classic NES series on Game Boy Advance, and then play them through the NES emulator instead. Like The Legend of Zelda. If you play the Game Boy Advance ROM of The Legend of Zelda, it will not work. It will just freeze and everything will move incredibly slowly and you won't be able to control anything in the game. But if you play it through the NES emulator, you're good to go. It's the same game. I mean, all they did was scale the pixels so that they would display properly on a Game Boy Advance, and the emulator does a pretty good job of that natively. Plus, you're not limited to just the dozen or so games that came out in the United States. You can also play any other NES game on your Game Boy Advance. And unlike the GBA games, you can actually use save states with this. The shoulder buttons on the top of your Game Boy Advance or SP will take you to the menu where you can load states, save states, and change your display settings, among other things, in NES emulation. This functionality also works with the Game Boy/Game Boy Color emulator, the Goomba.gba file, which, by the way, if I didn't already say that, you drop Goomba.gba and the NES emulator into your GBA sys folder. I've hidden the GBA sys folder in the options menu so I don't accidentally mess anything up, but I will show you Game Boy functionality right now. I've picked a small selection of Game Boy games that I own and put backup files of them on the micro SD card, and let's just do Solar Strikers since that's one of the Game Boy games I owned as a kid with my very first Game Boy, and I know for some people this is a rather simplistic shooter, and I'm not going to argue it's not, but for me, the charm of having a shoot 'em up game on my original Game Boy and the very good sound design and smooth scrolling graphics made it appealing then and nostalgic now. I still get some enjoyment out of playing Solar Striker, even though there are far superior shoot 'em ups available not just on Game Boy but in general. It's fun to revisit this game every now and then. Unfortunately, it's not the easiest thing in the world to play looking through a camera lens instead of holding the Game Boy Advance a normal distance from your face, but I've got the double shot now, so I think that's a good point at which to do a save state. So once again, you squeeze the shoulder buttons at the top, you can load, save, exit takes you right back to the top level menu of the game. Whatever you choose to do from that point is up to you, but I'm going to cycle the power and go back and show you a Game Boy Advance game. I've picked a rather unusual one here that some of you might not be familiar with, because even if you know the Mega Man Battle Network series, which I've loaded up on my micro SD card, you might not know Rockman EXE 4.5, which came out only in Japan between Mega Man Battle Network 4 and Mega Man Battle Network 5. I've got a boxed edition of it, and it's shelf candy to be sure, because seeing something numbered 4.5 instead of 4 and 5, it just really catches the eye. And it's in an oversized box to boot. It doesn't even look like a normal Japanese Game Boy Advance box. What I need now is an IPS language patch so that I can play EXE 4.5 in English. I know it was designed to be played in Japanese, but unfortunately I am not that fluent in the written Japanese language. But even despite that limitation, I can still BS my way through this to a certain degree, just thanks to my familiarity with the Battle Network games. Like, here I'm obviously setting a name, and at first I thought I was only going to be able to use kanji characters, but then I scrolled down and saw English, so why not go ahead and give myself an English name instead? And once I've entered it, I believe I can go down to the very bottom of the right-hand corner and select that option to save the name I've chosen. We'll see if I'm right. Let's go with Flash. Scroll down and save the name, and yes, I've created my profile for Rockman EXE 4.5, and it saves all of your in-game data, battery backed up data, to the micro SD card, so you never have to worry about losing any of your data. It is battery backed up. All of that happens behind the scenes in the memory manager for a save state for each Game Boy Advance game, so you never have to worry about keeping track of which file for which game. The EverDrive can handle that for you. You just boot up your ROM of choice and your save files will already be there. I'm Mr. MegaManFan. Thanks for watching, and I hope you try out the EverDrive GBA X5 for yourself. It's a very handy device, and I will be using it quite a bit. This is Mr. MegaManFan. Like, share, comment, subscribe. You know all the things to do. Today I have a package from the Ukraine. That's right, all the way from Eastern Europe to the United States. And it took about 2 months to get here, but considering it's sold out everywhere else, it was well worth the trouble. And what did I get? Well, you'll see in a second once I remove the seal, but first, I have to say I was a little bit confused when I ordered directly from Krikzz, because I was under the impression that he and his family had moved to Spain to avoid the current crisis in his homeland, but I guess his operations must have remained behind instead of coming with him, because they're shipped out from the Ukraine and not Spain, and it took a long time to clear customs there, and took a little while to clear customs here, but once it did, I have the EverDrive GGX7, the latest and best EverDrive for the Sega Game Gear, which can also play Sega Master System games on your Game Gear or Game Gear compatible device. But like all EverDrives, you have to go through a few steps to prepare it. It doesn't come preloaded with anything. It doesn't have an operating system or any games on it, so you gotta do a little bit of the legwork yourself. You gotta dump your own games or have backups of your games. Not gonna tell you how to do that, but you can figure that out for yourself. The operating system, on the other hand, is publicly available on a couple of places. Krikzz website has it, StoneAgeGamer.com has it, and I'm sure there are other resources that have backups of the operating system as well. But you gotta put it on a micro SD card, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, some Flash or EverDrive devices tend to be a little picky about what kind of micro SD brand they work with, so I always keep several different ones on hand in several different sizes. And I decided to try the SanDisk 32 gigabyte micro SD because the file sizes for Game Gear and Master System games are pretty small. You're not going to need a lot of storage, and I was happy to learn that this one was compatible with the GGX7, so I can recommend SanDisk, but I'm pretty sure other brands like Samsung or ON will work as well. Oddly enough, the cheap Walmart brand that's ON with 2 N's seems to work in just about everything. But as mentioned, you are going to need an operating system, so I'm getting it from StoneAgeGamer.com. Make sure that you download the compatible operating system for your device, because there's one for the original EverDrive Game Gear, and then there's a different set for the X series, and you want to get the latest version that's been made, which is 1.04 as of the making of this video. It could have changed by the time you're watching it, which would only mean that Krikzz has added more features to it, so if there's something more recent than 1.04, grab that instead. After that, the process is relatively the same whether you're on a Mac or a PC. You need to put the micro SD card in an SD card adapter, put it in your computer somehow, whether you have a port for it or a USB hub, and then you need to reformat it as MS-DOS FAT32. Don't use macOS Journaled, don't use FAT16, use MS-DOS FAT32. That will guarantee 100% compatibility with the file structure that Krikzz uses on the EverDrive. Every EverDrive that I've ever owned has been FAT32. And some of the other devices that you might use, like Terra Onion or PSIO or XStation, whatever, those might be supporting a wide variety of formatting. But as far as I can tell, FAT32 for EverDrives. It's just what you do. At this point, you want to unzip the operating system, put the SMS sys in the root directory of your micro SD card, and then create a separate folder called backup or ROMs or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter, it'll find it if you just give it any old label, and that's where you're going to put your games. Once you put the ROMs in that folder, it's all downhill from there. You eject the micro SD, you put the micro SD in your GGX7, and you put your GGX7 in the Game Gear compatible device. You can either use an original Sega Game Gear or something like the Analog Pocket, which I am doing here. It will initialize the SMS sys and tell you that it's gone to a default state and press any key to continue. And once you do that and open your backup folder, all of your games will be there. And that's it. You're ready to go. You've got every Game Gear game you could possibly want to play on your EverDrive, whether it's through your original Game Gear or through a Pocket or through anything else that can play Game Gear games. If you really want to get wacky with it, you could put your EverDrive GGX7 into the Game Gear adapter that you can buy for analog Mega SG, and you could play your Sega Game Gear games through an adapter through the analog Mega SG, even though you could jailbreak your analog Mega SG and just play Game Gear games off an SD card in the slot. But if you want the games to be on an EverDrive that you can take out and put in a Game Gear, then maybe you'd do this instead. And obviously the convenience factor here is the huge benefit of the GGX7, because let's say you have a library of 100 or so Game Gear games like I do. Wouldn't you rather have all of them on demand when you want to play them instead of having to get out a cartridge every time you want to switch games? It's hugely beneficial. And if you have something like a Pocket, the GGX7, I'd say it unlocks the potential of it, because to date this system hasn't been jailbroken, so you can't play any ROMs directly off a micro SD in the Analog Pocket. But if you put micro SD with all your games in the EverDrive GGX7, that's your workaround. You can play what you want, even though the Analog Pocket hasn't been jailbroken. And the nice thing about this is you can play more than just Game Gear games. Allow me to demonstrate. I've created a second folder called Backup SMS, and I've put Sega Master System games in here. I'm going to play one of my all-time favorite SMS games. It's called The Ninja. And as you can see, because the Game Gear and the Sega Master System are so fundamentally the same, the Game Gear has a slightly different resolution, which means that if you try to play Game Gear games on a Sega Master System, you're going to get some overscan in a lot of cases, but other than that, they are virtually the same hardware. The Game Gear is just a scaled-down portable version of a Sega Master System, so is it any wonder that Sega Master System games work on a Game Gear or a Game Gear-compatible device? In fact, there are cartridge adapters that let you do what I'm talking about, play Sega Master System games on a Game Gear, so really this functionality being on an EverDrive GGX7 shouldn't come as any surprise. Although one of the extra features that might come as a surprise is that you can enable a hotkey for an in-game menu to use at any time. By default, it's set to up, 1 and 2 at the same time. Hit all 3 of those buttons, whichever ones are 1 and 2 for you, and you'll be able to access a menu where you can save a state, load a state, or go back to the main menu and select another game altogether. I will demonstrate that here by creating a save state after I beat the boss in the first stage of the ninja. And then I'll be able to go to stage 2 and go back into the menu and load back to stage 1. Watch as I do it. Create the save state. Once I get the camera in focus here. All right, I think we're good now. And now I can go on to stage 2. And I decide, oh, whoops, I wasn't ready for that yet. I'll go back to my previous save state. And now I can play it whenever I'm ready to, on demand. There's only one save state per game so far as I can tell. Maybe in a future revision of the firmware, Krikzz might add the ability to select different save states, but if you're trying to play a game to beat it, I think one save state is enough anyway. Unless you're some kind of speedrunner who's perfecting his craft and needs multiple save states at different times and places, this ought to be good enough. Gunstar Heroes is also a pleasure to see working on the GGX7. Previous EverDrives for Game Gear did not support that. Sorry, my watch is going off because I hit my move gold for the day. But anyway, yeah, Gunstar Heroes used to not be compatible with previous versions of the EverDrive for Game Gear, and with the X7, that support is now fully realized. So this is quite a powerful EverDrive, and one that I can recommend, even though it's been sold out at a lot of the different places that carry it, like Stone Age Gamer. I was able to order it from Krikzz.com. However, just keep in mind that because it's shipping out from the Ukraine, it's going to take a long time to get here, so you're going to wait a couple of months easily. The Neo Pocket GameDrive. And I needed a whole lot of things to make this work. I needed a micro SD card, and I needed some new watch batteries because the Neo Geo Pocket Color takes one for memory backup, and I needed the Neo Geo Pocket Color itself, along with some brand new AA batteries to power it. So yes, the Neo Geo Pocket Color needs 3 batteries, 2 to run it, and 1 for the system settings backup. Gotta have all those in there. And the reason it only needs 2 batteries is because it's not backlit, so make sure you have some sort of lighting arrangement to be able to see the screen unless you've had it modded with an IPS. Now, for me, I can actually see it perfectly clear through the camera screen because the camera itself has a light that shines on the screen. But other than that, if you're using this thing, you're probably going to want to play it next to a lamp or with some sort of worm light-like device like they used to sell for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. So put your watch battery in this slot here. You can use a penny to open the battery door, and you can also use it to lock it shut. Then your AA batteries go in the compartment on the left. Once you've got all your new batteries in and all the battery lids shut and everything buttoned down, you're going to power it on, and you're going to have to go through the system settings. Even if you had them set before, with new batteries in there, you're going to have to do it again. So select your language, select English, and select what you want non-color games to be. You've got a few different color palettes. You can do black and white, red or green, etc. At first I wanted to go with black and white, but then ultimately I changed my mind and went back and did green because it feels a little more like Game Boy, like the original Game Boy if you have monochrome green. But for what I'm going to end up doing with the Pocket GameDrive, we'll see it in color anyway, so not to worry about that. Date and time setting, I guess you might want that for some games, maybe save states or something, but I can't remember any use I had for the internal clock before. But since I've got a watch battery in there that's going to remember the settings, I might as well put it to the current date and time as of when I'm filming this, So, yes, you're realizing now that I filmed and edited this yesterday. It took a while too. You're going to see why here in a second, but have to make sure everything is working properly with all the new batteries in there. Can't just assume anything. So as you could see in that footage, I already had a cartridge loaded in. It was Rockman Battle and Fighter, which is essentially the Power Battles 1 and 2, a portableized version of the arcade games, which have appeared in several other forms, including at least one of the collections. I believe the GameCube one has the Power Battles. I can't remember off the top of my head for sure. I'd have to double check, but it also came on a cab that came with 5 fighting games, 10 games total, and that miniature arcade cab sells for $200 to $300, and the emulation on it is a little sus, so I've never spent the money to import it and get it. Didn't seem to me to be worth it when I can play it on a MAME cab or through emulation instead of spending $300 for an officially licensed copy that actually has screen tearing and graphic glitches and all sorts of other undesirable things. Now here's a piece of advice for all of you who do pick up this pocket GameDrive. It's got a very slow and cumbersome operating system. I'm told this is the best that can be done with the hardware and the available options to put a multi-cart into a system like this. So you may want to only load a few files onto a very small micro SD card. I think I way overshot the mark with a 64 gigabyte one. I don't need that much space, and I don't want to spend this much time scrolling through the menus. Every few games, it has to load the next few games on the list. And then there's the second limitation of this device, which is that once you select a game from the games that you have on your micro SD card, it's got to copy it to flash memory. And you have 15 megabytes of flash memory, which means you can hold approximately 7 2 megabyte games, or a few more or less, depending on if they're 4, 1, or even a half megabyte. Depends on the size of the file. But if you did like the maximum size that any Neo Geo Pocket Color games ever reached, you'd have 4 games and maybe not even that, maybe 3 games, and you wouldn't be able to get the 4th because you'd run out of memory. So, limitations here. And as you can see from watching this, flashing a game to the memory from your micro SD card is not a rapid process. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a very cool device because there's nothing else like it, and there's no other way you're going to be able to play your ROMs on a Neo Geo Pocket Color. You might be able to buy a bootleg cart of some kind that has multiple games on it, but if you want to use backups of your original games or select your own ROMs or play Homebrew, well, it's called Homebrew Review after all, so that's sort of the idea, right? You want to be able to play fan-made games on your portable systems, on your home consoles, and this is a way you're going to be able to do it with the Neo Geo Pocket or the Pocket Color. Just make sure that you accept the fact that going in, it's not going to be rapid fire like an EverDrive N8 Pro or a Mega EverDrive Pro or a Super HD System 3. This is not those kind of lightning speeds. You're going to be able to do what you want, but it's going to take you a while to do it. So after taking a very long time scrolling through my list of games on the SD card and a very long time flashing the games I wanted to the system memory of the Pocket GameDrive, I finally had 5 games loaded that I could use from the flash memory. At least they're all loaded into the memory, so each time you turn on your Neo Geo Pocket Color with the GameDrive loaded, you can access any of the games that you flashed. You won't need to flash them again a second time. They will be saved in the flash memory until you erase them or replace them. And as you can see, the games that are in the flash memory do work, and they don't take nearly as long to load to play as they did to select and flash to the memory in the first place. And it works perfectly. Everything is functioning in Sonic the Hedgehog the way I would expect it to for this iteration for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, which is one of the best reasons to own one, is this particular Sonic game. It's been called one of the best portable Sonic games that you can play. It was designed specifically with this system in mind, which is a little strange when you think about it, because this is an SNK system, and Sega making a game for an SNK system, it was unusual at the time, and it even still seems unusual now, but here it is. So, I can recommend the Pocket GameDrive. As long as you know the limitations and accept them going in, you'll have full access to all games and homebrews made for this system.